everybody, and welcome to a very special interview with a good friend of mine and someone who I admire and respect immensely. Now, it's very, very good news for all of us because all of the experiences and the wisdom of this young gentleman next to me, he won't mind me saying that, has been put into this rather amazing book. And I'm going to let him talk all about it, and I'm going to ask him a few questions as we go, and I'm going to pick out the best bits so you guys can hear what hear and see what he has to say. So, welcome, Mr. Richard Digby Smith.
Nice to be here, Simon. Thank you. Mind you, I live here, so it's always nice.
Yeah, this
to
is
be
his
here.
house. This is your studio, and
This is my
This is
studio.
the creative hub. Actually, should we start off by actually just doing a little bit of a backtrack before we even talk about this book? Why I'm extra excited is because Digby has got so much experience in the music business, and he has met and worked with some of the greats, and I'm guessing that he's not going to tell us all the secrets because this is for you to get hold of, and we'll tell you at the end of this video where you can get this, and it's very, very much a recommended read because it's also humorous as well as, you know, obviously involved in all the record industry. But I'm going to let Digby talk about it. So, but before we do that, tell us a little bit about what you're up to these days, because I know you're kind of in semi-retirement, dare I say.
Yes, indeed. I'm in semi-retirement, but it doesn't mean that I still don't have an undying passion and love for things musical. And having worked in studios of varying sizes and shapes around the world, I'm now in my favourite studio of all, which is mine. And it's here. It's basically a Logic-based system. It's modest. I'm surrounded by all my guitars and my keyboard and all my sounds, and I have the most wonderful time here doing, in actual fact, what I started out doing 50 years ago when I first had this crazy idea in my head about wanting to get a job in a recording studio. And the first couple of chapters in the book will tell you how challenging that was back in 1969, before we had the internet and photocopiers and all the kind of social media. I mean, without going on too much about it, but I had to literally drag myself around the streets of London and knock on an awful lot of doors. But I came at it from an approach of wanting to be basically a musician, like my dad was. I never quite made the grade as a musician, although I can tinkle on the ivories a bit and I can play a bit of guitar.
He's actually very, very good.
But I've got an understanding of music, and I have a good theory based knowledge, thanks in part to my O-level music teacher, Mr. Birkin, who sadly is not mentioned in the book, but there are other stories about my school days. So I'm actually back full circle, where I've got a little recording set up in my own home, and I'm surrounded by instruments, and I'm combining engineering, producing, and playing and composing and performing. So it's only taken 50 years, but I finally got there.
That's absolutely awesome. Now, one thing that obviously we're gonna go into a little bit of detail about the book, but one thing I want to ask straight away, being involved in the industry for so long, you must have seen so many different changes. And as a teacher, you know, I probably go back only 25 years of changes, but even within that, we saw all the development of MIDI, and they've been able to, you know, use your computer. In my day, it was the Atari when it started out, etc., etc. But the main question that I want to firstly ask is, what has kept you going for 50 years within music? Because it must have been, like you say, really challenging at times. What is that point that, you know, you have kept going for 50 years in the industry and had your ups and your downs? We'll talk a bit more about those as we go through. But what's kept you at it, and how would you, you know, put that across to people that are just starting out, and to inspire them in a similar way so that they might even end up with 50 years of experience in the industry as well?
The answer to that question, Si, is probably very similar to the first response I gave. It was that my undying verging on psychotic obsession with music. And although the technology and the infrastructure surrounding the capturing and recording of music has changed dramatically over the decades, it's still the same 12 notes and it's still the same vocabulary. So the basic process that is a challenge to songwriters and performers hasn't changed. And Simon mentions his 25 years and the amount of change that's taken place in that 25 years. I can attest to the fact that the 25 years prior to when Simon got involved, which is when I got involved, the change was happening then as well.
Yeah,
it's not as, I don't know who it was that said, the beauty about the easiest thing to understand about the future is that it happens one day at a time. And I can remember being in recording studios when the first cassette machines came along. That was going to be the end of the music industry. People will be copying music off the radio. Then the first drum machines came along. That's going to be the end of drumming. And it didn't happen.
But there's always that kind of soothsaying type of thing. When something new comes up, it's always a death knell for something. But it's actually never been that way, has it? Because it evolves.
It becomes an addition.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's something else to incorporate into it. I learnt my craft on the grind wheel of analog. And believe you me, it was a grind wheel. It was torturous stuff to work with. Not a huge improvement on the wax cylinders that preceded it. I mean, it was basic. It was pretty primitive stuff.
Yeah.
Very little control, no recall, distortion, tape hiss, noise. I always tell people that those wonderful records from the 70s and 80s that were made on analog tape, mostly 8, 16 and 24 track, were great sounding records and are still great sounding records, not because they were recorded on tape, but despite the fact that they were recorded on tape. So I'm much happier in this world. I love it.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? It's nostalgia isn't what it used to be. So you started as a tape op as well, didn't you?
That's what we were called, tape ops, and we operated tape. That's hence the name. Lots of big bulky tape machines, lots of big bulky heavy reels of tape, which invariably you ran out of tape at exactly the wrong time when the band were probably doing their definitive performance and the tape machine would run out. It always did. It would never fail at the beginning of take 1. It always failed on take 3 when everything was coming together. So you'd always run out of tape. Oftentimes it would play back and one of the tracks hadn't been aligned correctly. So there was no cut and paste, no recall. It was very seat of your pants. It was very.
Must be quite exciting. Though,
it was very exciting.
Yeah.
Exciting to the point of being terrifying, actually. Yeah. And as with the period prior to my coming into the business, which was the late 60s, early 70s. If you go back through time, through the 60s and 50s and even the 40s, the similarity there was that what you recorded, what you got, was what you heard, and it was 80% of what came across was down to the sound at source, both in terms of the musical performance and in terms of the sound of the instruments. So it was absolutely vital that you got the sound correct at source.
At source, yeah.
And when I came into the business in early 1970, I had the pleasure and good fortune of working with a lot of old school engineers who'd grown up in that era. So microphone selection, microphone placement, signal to noise ratio, was absolutely paramount. It was everything, and only then did you hit the record. The only musicians you would find yourself in the studio with would be proper musicians. You wouldn't set foot in a studio unless you were a proper musician. There were no fakers, there were no wannabes, there were no gonna-bees. All the people that turned up at recording studios were professional musicians.
Yeah.
And then in the 60s and 70s, obviously you had amateur musicians, if you like, or musicians that hadn't taught under any orthodoxy of how to read music, but they could all command their instrument, and so there was a quality threshold that had to be met. So from my point of view as a young engineer, you were blessed with very skillful people.
Learning from the best.
Yes.
I happen to know that there was a particular best, and I believe he's endorsed this book, Mr. J. Page, and you were involved in recording a rather special solo, weren't you?
I was involved in recording the whole of the backing track as well as the solo for one of my all-time favourite Zeppelin tracks, Stairway to Heaven. I was due to have, it was after a very intense period of work, I got a phone call from Sally Whiteman, who was the studio manager, and she said, I know it's your night off, Digby, but you've got to come in.
Yeah.
The other assistant engineer, Bob's phoned in sick, so you got to come in. And I was most disgruntled because I was looking forward to a night off. I said, who's it with? She said, the Zepp boys. I said, I'm on my way. And Led Zeppelin recorded a lot of Zepp 3 and Zepp 4 at the Basing Street, Island Records Basing Street Studios in West London. And as one of the up-and-coming assistant engineers, you had the pleasure of being in the control room with the likes of Led Zeppelin, with the late great Andy Johns as the senior engineer, and I was assisting for Andy. I mentioned a guy, Bob Potter. Bob assisted on a lot of the Zepp stuff as well. In fact, between me and Bob, we assisted on pretty much most of Zepp 3 and Zepp 4 recording and mixing work that was done at Basing Street. A large part of it was done out at Headley Grange, their remote facility.
The classic drum sound, which is interesting. The Spitfire sample guys, I think it's a couple of years ago now, they made the Grange sample pack, and it's got Roger Taylor, and it's got Andy Gangadine, and also Chad Smith from the Chili Peppers, and they set up in the stairwell, and they got the most authentic sound that they could by putting the tree up through the actual, there's 3 layers up the stairwell and everything else. So.
Well, at Basing Street, Studio 1 upstairs, which was the larger of the 2 studios that we had at Basing Street, Studio 1 was a massive room with very high ceilings. And probably 75% of the drum sound on Stairway to Heaven is captured by, if I can, other microphones will be available, but the 75% of the drum sound of Stairway to Heaven was captured by a Bayer M500 ribbon mic suspended about 2 feet above, 2 or 3 feet above the drum kit, heavily compressed, and that was the bulk of the drum sound. Of course, a large part of the drum sound was John Bonham and his amazing sounding drum kit.
When you talk about these amazing experiences, it still has a kind of a mythical quality, and there's a magic to it. Do you think that that perhaps some of the youngsters they're expecting things too quickly without the kind of experimentation stage of being able to say, well, we don't have to do it like this, we can do it like that, or we can try adding that guitar onto this or whatever? Do you think that there's things that have become a little bit more formulaic, perhaps?
They have indeed, and this goes back to what I mentioned earlier. You could have the quality of the musicianship that you were listening to and recording was of such high standard. You could have recorded Stairway to Heaven on a cassette machine, and it would still sound great. It would still sound sensational. So you were less dependent on the technology. You were more dependent, in fact, almost entirely dependent on the delivery from the musicians.
And your ability to hear, I guess,
and your ability to know how to capture it. And I was blessed to have the opportunity to work alongside, for instance, Andy Johns, who's resume and CV. I go into detail in the book, as with his older brother Glyn Johns. Those two guys, for a greater part of the 1970s, were two of the most in-demand engineers stroke producers of the period. In fact, I remember a conversation with Glyn one time where he politely mentioned to me, Digby, I was the first freelance engineer.
Really? Wow.
And I have no reason to doubt him. And of course, his younger brother Andy was just as in demand. Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, The Who, The Beatles. I mean, anybody that was anybody. You worked with Glyn and Andy.
Yeah.
And
you can't talk about rock music really without talking about Andy in particular. I mean,
certainly from the English this side of the Atlantic, as contribution would have been Glyn and Andy, and there's lots of great stories about Glyn and Andy.
And Andy as well. So tell us what actually made you go to America in the first place, and was that a decision that was a hard decision, and what opportunities did it open up?
I was approached by two of Ireland's two bands that were signed to Ireland, a band called Free, and another band called Free, who I'd spent quite a lot of time in the studio, initially with Andy on the earlier albums, Highway, Fire and Water.
My favourite albums.
Highway's one of my favourite albums. My Brother Jay, what a cracking song.
That's amazing.
And then I later went on to actually sit in the driving seat with Free at Last, Heartbreaker, and a hybrid album that was half of the members of Free was an album called Kossoff Kurt Tetsu Rabbit, KKTR. So I was approached by both of these bands for their forthcoming tours that they were about to embark on. Free were off to Japan, and Head, Hands and Feet, who were the other band signed to Ireland, were off to the United States. And either by default or design, I'm not sure, I found myself with Head, Hands and Feet, States bound. Now, Head, Hands and Feet were a wonderful outfit with Tony Colton and Ray Smith, two of the top pop writers of the 60s, teaming up with guitar legend Albert Lee and Pete Gavin on drums and Charlie Hodges on bass, guitar, fiddle, piano, later one half of the famous Chaz and Dave duo. So I was in good company. In fact, Chaz pretty much chaperoned me all the way around the United States.
Wow.
So I opted to go. I felt like a change. I'd been in the studio, this would be summer of 72, so I'd spent 2.5 years in the studio almost every day. I was getting a little bit burnt out, and here was a chance to go travel the world, which I couldn't resist. And we did a 2-month tour of the United States in the summer of 72, and we went from west coast to east coast, north to south, back to the east coast, back to the west coast. I mean, it was an incredible itinerary of visiting just about every single major city in the US, typical of bands touring the States at that time in the early to mid 70s. And I particularly felt a compelling attraction to Southern California, and I met a young lady out there, and when I got back to England after the tour, life was not the same anymore. In the same way as when I first moved to London from Birmingham, that was quite a culture, not so much a culture shock, but a culture awakening.
Yes.
And then to go from London to, as I say, America and specifically Los Angeles was it was like the same thing happened all over again.
Yeah.
And combined, as I think I mentioned just before we did the last edit, it goes back to the beginning again, as all things do. It was my love of music and wanting to be a musician, wanting to be a songwriter. I always felt that, not so much a songwriter, but certainly a musician. I always felt that was something I could do, and I always wanted to do.
Yes.
But to me, the engineering was almost like a little sidetrack, but it brought me in touch with so much music that it was as beautiful a sidetrack as you could have wished to happen. And So come the summer of 1975, with my relationship with a Californian lady, by then well established, I found I was missing Los Angeles. I was missing the Southern California lifestyle. Plus,
Sun.
I was missing the weather. I was
Yeah,
missing
yeah.
the whole LA SoCal lifestyle. And I was, as I mentioned in the book, I was suffering from studio burnout. I do refer to Steve Redgrave, the British Olympic oarsman, who I remember after his, not comparing myself directly with him in any way, but just in terms of a comment he made when he was dragged out of his boat for the fifth time after his fifth Olympic gold. He said to the newspaper, to the news reporter, if you ever see me near a boat again, you have my permission to shoot me. And I felt that same way then about recording studios. If I don't ever see another recording studio again, it'll be too soon. So to up sticks and move out to California, I took my guitar and a few t-shirts, and I was going to learn to play. But before too long, I was approached by somebody from the Island Records West Coast office, and was in the studio with a lovely guy, Spencer Davis, producing a record, and I got Chris Blackwell, the Island Records boss, introduced me to all the Island Records team out in LA. So it seemed like I couldn't escape the recording studio, and before too long, I was in the studio making records with many people.
Many people, and. In terms of a record that would stick in my mind, you ended up working with Sparks, didn't you?
That was before I went to the States. Yeah.
Okay. That was actually in the UK first?
I think it was just. I think the two albums we did that I engineered on, along with a guy called Tony Platt, another successful engineer from the Island stable. Were the first two Sparks albums for Ireland, which were Kimono My House and Propaganda. Again, loads of stories about working with Ron and Russell in the book, and how they came to get signed to the label, and as importantly for me, working with one of the finest record producers of the modern era, Mr. Muff Winwood, who was just always a joy to work with, and a great mentor, and a great role model, upon who I was have attempted to sort of fashion a lot of my approaches to studio life from working with people like Muff. Very relaxed, very enjoyable, and no ego. And I'm running out of things to say about Muff, because he was just great. Worked on 2 or 3 records with Muff. So the Sparks stuff was before I moved to the States. I think it probably wasn't too long ago. That would have been 73, 74, the Sparks stuff. And then, by the summer of 75, I was, I'd done my 10,000 hours of recording studio life, and I needed to come up for air. And where better to come up for air than in the orange blossom, fragrant atmosphere of Southern California, And I figured I'd be there for 6 months or so. I was out there for almost 9 years.
9 years. And you had a bit of a love for football when you were out there as well, didn't you?
Always a love of football. That's always somewhat gone alongside my love of music, and music has probably just gained the edge over the years. Although there are similarities in that I was very good at football, but not quite good enough to make the grade. I was very good at playing the guitar, but not quite good enough to become a guitarist, if you know what I mean by that difference. But yeah, always played football every day of my life, from the age of about 3 till I was about 43, till somebody tried to kill me on a football pitch with a tackle, and I decided to hang up my boots at that point. But my love of football intertwines throughout this musical career. I played for Island Records football team in the Music Business League.
There must have been some interesting characters that you played with and against.
There were some interesting characters we played with and against. Again, all references in the book.
And I know, but you're going to have to get the book, because some great stories.
There were some of the musicians were football, like music. Football and music just go hand in hand. There's a universal love that goes with both, and a universal appeal. I can think of one musician in particular who sang and spoke of universal love in great detail, with great passion, and it was reflected in his behaviour and ability on the football pitch as well. And I suspect you might have an idea who I'm talking about. When I first moved out to LA permanently, I'd been out there several times before I made the final definitive move. I got introduced by Lionel Conway, who ran Ireland's West Coast Publishing Company. Lionel introduced me to a good friend of his who was an expat living in Los Angeles by the name of Stewart. So I met Rod and the team of mostly expat English guys playing football out in LA there, and we played regularly. I mean regularly, almost without interruption, every Wednesday evening and every Sunday afternoon. And there weren't many times then when Rod didn't
really?
Grace us with his presence. Even if he were, on a couple of occasions, I seem to remember, he'd been on tour in Australia and he still turned up on the Wednesday night. So that's how important the football.
Committed.
It was.
Wow.
So and again, there's many predominantly hilarious tales, if I say so myself in all honesty, about some of the football matches and some of the people we played against.
It must have been quite difficult actually to be able to put. Let me just go grab it again. It's over here still. To actually have to put all the experiences into this one book. How did you decide what was going to go into it?
It kind of decides for itself, Simon. I'd never written a book before. Short stories, essays at school, in junior school mostly, but I'd had no experience I had no clue where to start. And it's predominantly full of a bunch of anecdotes that I think over the years friends and family have possibly tired from hearing. So I was encouraged to write some of them down, if only to shut up. And those few anecdotes, and if anybody has any ideas about attempting to be an author, it'll happen for you. It becomes one of those processes, like with music actually, and I know Simon will attest to this, because when you're playing on the drums, do you know what drum fill you're going to do next? You don't really, do you? You go into it kind of like feet first, and you hope that you come out of it the other end with something that's made sense. Well, that's the anecdotes expand, and then you start backfilling in some of the detail, and then it links to something else, and before you know it, 360 pages isn't enough, because I've already thought of stuff I've omitted.
That you would like to,
Having said that, I'll spare the unsuspecting general public. There probably won't be a second volume. There isn't quite enough to squeeze out another volume, but there might be a few things. If it goes to a reprint, there might be a couple of additions.
But you certainly kept busy. So through the 90s, 2 hit records on both sides of the world, basically. How did that feel? Tell the audience, what the albums were, and these, you probably all heard of one of them in particular.
It's a funny old game, this music business. I got approached by Muff Winwood, who was by that time working at Sony, S2, Sony Records, and he asked me to come along and engineer with a band called Reef for, I believe, their second album, which was called Glow. I was involved in the recording of 5 of the tracks that went on the Glow album, the bulk of which we recorded at Abbey Road Studios in London, which in itself is a story that's told in there, a dream come true. Some months earlier, I had, long story, but I'd found myself in Japan, working with a Japanese band who were at the time referred to as being the Oasis of Japan. So I was told they were a band called Yellow Monkey, and I spent a couple of weeks out in Japan at a wonderful studio in Tokyo recording their, I believe it was like their 5th album. Then we came back to England and went to Peter Gabriel's wonderful, magical facilities up at Real World where we did all the overdubs and the mixes. So that were 2 albums that I'd had under my belt, and they were both released at similar times.
Similar times, yeah.
And the Yellow Monkey album went to #1 on the whole of the Southeast Asia and
Yeah.
the East Coast there, Japan and Korea. So that was a #1 record in the Far East, and the Reef album went to #1 in the UK at exactly the same time. So as my wife Kim expressed at the time, for a brief 2-week period, the sun didn't set on my hit records, and I'm very pleased to be able to say that.
Excellent. There is a story about Peter Gabriel's recording as well, isn't there? About Thomas the Tank Engine. I always remember that one. I bet that didn't get into
Simon, yes, it did.
Did
Simon,
it really? Oh, fantastic.
You won't need to read the book actually, because he's heard most
Thomas
of
the
the
Tank
stories.
Engine is brilliant. Oh,
When I worked at Real World at Peter Gabriel's, for, as I say, you can only describe it as magical, because that's what it is. It's in a magical part of the world in the West Country, right by the Great Western Region main line, railway line, linking London with the west and the southwest, and having a bit of a passion for trains and what have you, that sort of added.
That's
to
another
it.
thing with musicians, I think, isn't it?
Yeah,
I've had a
yes.
lot of people that are into planes and trains as
Planes,
well.
trains, football.
Football.
Yeah, not necessarily in that order. So I did record a couple of projects at Real World. I think we did some pre-production with Reef at Real World as well. So it was obviously one of the to-go-to places.
Yes.
On one particular project, it may well have been the first time I'd ever worked. It was most certainly the first time I'd ever worked at Real World. So it was probably with the Japanese band. We set up our stall in the studio and carried on with the guitar overdubs, and at the end of the day, all the guys in the band and producers and all the entourage, we were all assigned different rooms in the house, in the main house, after we'd sat down to, as was the custom every evening, to sit down to what can only be described as a banquet of a meal.
Yes, yeah.
And Peter Gabriel in attendance would come and chat with us and ask us if everything was okay in the studios, anything you need, let me know. Very accommodating, likeable young man that he was. So by the time it came to assigning me some accommodation, most of the rooms in the house had gone. So they suggested that there was a small cottage just around the corner from the studio where, if I so chose, I could stay there for the night. And I have to admit, having spent all day with the band,
Yeah,
the
you
idea of
your own space.
having my own
Yeah.
space for which would have been for the next week or two, however long we were there. So I was given the keys to a cottage, given some brief directions as to where it was. I mean, it was literally around the corner from the studio. So down this quiet, unlit country lane I do walk, looking for the number, or whatever the number of the cottage was, and I see a little terrace of small cottages, and I'm thinking that must be it. I find the correct address, the correct cottage. I put the key in the door and I walk in. Tiny, low ceiling, little quaint, typical little West Country cottage. And as you come in the hallway, it's just stairs going up, so you just go up, and all along the stairway were watercolour pictures of steam engines that had faces on the front of them. And then when I got up to the landing, there was shelving and shelves, and there were little characters, and I remember recognising the Fat Controller and little station masters and railway workers, and more paintings and watercolours, and I'm looking at these, I'm thinking these look pretty authentic.
Yeah.
And then I heard the train go rattling past, and the penny dropped. I was staying in the Thomas the Tank Engine house. It's where the Reverend Audrey, who wrote the original tales of Thomas the Tank Engine, it's where he'd lived and written all those stories. And it was Lawn House. And I think it might be available and open to the public, but in any event, I stayed in a Thomas the Tank Engine house.
That's proper rock and roll, isn't it?
It's rock
Everybody?
and roll,
That's
isn't
brilliant.
it? Yeah.
So we absolutely recommend this book. Available at Amazon and all good stores. I'll put the links in the description underneath. What are you working on at the moment, Dick? Because I know that you are still available if anybody wants your production work and so on and so forth. But it never stops, does it?
It never stops, and since myself and the family moved down to Devon here in the south of England 8 or 9 years ago now, I'm actually unsurprised at the amount of talent, the people I've met, Simon included, great gifted musicians, committed people with a devotion and a love to their music. And I always remember I was always told by one of my early mentors that it doesn't matter whether you're in the studio with Led Zeppelin or you're in the studio with Joe Bloggs and his local band, you observe the same attention to detail, and you observe the same quality control, and apply yourself just the same as you would in both instances. And although I haven't done any further recording with Led Zeppelin since I moved down to Devon, I have found myself in the studio with some amazing bands. The Simmertones, who are a local ska band, Lion Star, a local reggae band, Sarah Yo is a very gifted singer-songwriter. I've done a couple of records with Sarah. Nick Tilley, top guitar player. Simon, we've done a lot of recording work together. If you need a drummer or a guitar player or a bass player, multi-instrumentalist. So an immense amount of talent, as there is in all corners of the world, in all little pockets of society, you find talented people. So semi-retired, maybe, working just as hard as ever and loving it more each day.
You got a website?
I got a website, TQ1 Music.
TQ1 Music, easy to remember. Put that in the description below as well. If there's one piece of advice you could give anybody that's just starting out, what would that one piece of advice be? It can only be one.
The one piece of advice would have to be, what's applied to me, is persistence. I'll expand that one word into a description of it. A dogged, almost obsessive, a dogged obsessiveness to
determination.
A determination, unstoppable. Be prepared to take a lot of
crap,
a lot of crap, a lot of well, failure's probably too strong a word. I mean, lives don't depend on any of the work I've done or missed out on or could have perhaps done differently or something. But so it isn't a life or death occupation. But there will be disappointments and things don't. And be open-minded. It won't always go. You might start off in this direction, but things sometimes veer off, and you'd be mindful to pursue that wherever it takes you.
Some of the best opportunities come from those veering off, and that suddenly happened.
Most definitely.
And there's plenty of those in this book. So before we go, Digby, would you mind awfully in showing us something that you've been working on recently? I just want to say a huge thank you. You're always inspirational to me personally. I met you, it must have been about 10 years ago now, and your passion for music hasn't waned. And I think everybody could learn something by taking some of the stories and experiences. They're not just stories. And this man is very, very modest, and I think that's one of the things that has been how he's managed to get on so well. He's never pushed his own kind of you've got so much passion and you've got so many ideas, but you've never forced those on them. Even when we were working with kids that were coming through, you're experienced by all this time, but at not one point did you ever belittle any of those kids that were coming through for the first time, and you was always encouraging them with that kind of mentoring mentality and humility, really. And I think that's very, very important. So what are you going to play us?
I'm going to play you a track from recently recorded here down in Devon with a band called Jefferson Archive, featuring the vocals of Miss Danny Turner, and this is a track called It Wasn't Just the Rain.
Thanks very much, Digby.
Thank you, Simon.
Shouldn't do that. We are now.
Oh,
We'll have to. Yes,
well,
Corona verb.
do this.
That's
do the
another
Coronas.
point. Yes. Make sure you get a copy of this amazing 1, 2, 3, 4 testing.